Hey there and welcome to the channel. You're watching The Light in My Library. So today we're going to talk about Summer Night by Jim Butcher, book 4 of the Dresden Files. I got to start off with kind of a funny story about this book. So I originally read it back when I read the first 3 books in the series. Pretty close in relation to them, but I don't know if I was just COVID brain or whatever, because I think I did have COVID when I read this book, or if I was just drunk or whatever, but I absolutely 100% forgot about reading it. And I reread the entire book about a month ago, thinking I had not read it. And then every time I got to a new scene, I'd be like, oh, I know this scene. I must have read to this point in the book. And then I'd get to the next scene and be like, oh, no, I read this scene too. But I couldn't remember what happened next in the story at any point in time. And so it's just a kind of funny experience that I had with the book. And I don't know. I just wanted to share that with you all. But let's talk about Summer Night. So, book 4 of the Dresden Files, I think that it is an improvement for sure over both Grave Peril and Full Moon, and starting to get back up to the level in the series of Stormfront, but also starting to introduce a lot of the wider world of Dresden Files. I talked in previous videos about how Jim Butcher was kind of subtly laying the groundwork for his greater world, but that he was focusing on the case in that specific book. And I think that this book serves as a really good transition and a really good ending to kind of what I consider the first arc in this series into the larger arc. The next arc. And it does a good job of striking a balance between the more classic detective novels that you have in the first 3 books and a fantasy novel, which is what you get to in the later books in the series. I mean, obviously, they're all fantasy books, but there's a marked difference between Stormfront and something like, I keep thinking Turncoat, but that's a bad example. Deadbeat would be a really good one. That's just through and through fantasy, and the mystery detective novel aspect really takes a back seat at that point in the series to just the epic fantasy story that's going on by that point. So, into the non-spoiler section of the review. This book picks up not long after the events of the last book, just like every book in Dresden Files. But it is dealing largely with the ramifications of, obviously, spoiler for earlier books in the Dresden Files, but the war that Dresden basically started in Grave Peril while rescuing Susan. It starts off with Dresden very lonely and depressed, Susan having left to go deal with her own issues now. But it does bring us the reintroduction of Billy and the werewolves and really starts to develop them as characters and as an important part of Dresden's life. And we will see them grow a lot more throughout the series. It also is at the very beginning of the book, we have our first introduction to the White Council, proper introduction. Obviously, the concept was introduced all the way back in book 1, but now we get to see it. I'm not going to consider that a spoiler because it's like chapter 4. So I have to say that the climax to this book is one of my top 3 probably so far in the series for a climax to a Dresden book. Stormfront is exciting and everything. Full Moon has a good ending, and so does Grave Peril, but this is the first high stakes. I don't know, it's a Dresden conclusion, but on a whole different level. And it really ups the ante, so to speak, as compared to the previous books in the series. Also, the mystery in this book is a legitimately good one, and I think maybe one of the most hardcore, if you are paying close attention and you are good at guessing, you have a legitimate chance of guessing who the bad guy is well in advance of when Dresden figures it out. We also get to see in this book more development of Murphy as a character, we just had her being kind of dumb in one book, and then in the next book she was brutalized, and we really start to get to know her as she's recovering from that. And I really appreciate that, and I'm really excited. Keep in mind, I'm only on book 11. I'm really excited to see where Murphy is going to continue to go as a character, and this book definitely got me excited for Murphy as a character in ways that I hadn't been before. And sorry if you're offended by me calling her dumb in Full Moon, but I really do think she was being kind of dumb. I think that Dresden was also being stupid, that if he had just taken a second to explain 5 things to her, then the conflict between them could have been resolved. But I also think that Murphy went nuclear when she didn't need to. So those are my thoughts on Full Moon. Two books ago, I should have included that in that video, but it is what it is. So let's go ahead and jump into the actual review here. We're going to give Dresden Files I'm going to say an 8.5 out of 10 for pacing. This book is very fast-paced throughout, just like a lot of the earlier books, and very succinct, but I did feel a little bit bogged down in the Walmart scene. I felt like it dragged on just a little bit longer than it needed to, and the character of the tigress in general, I feel like, is a little bit of a distraction that I didn't need in this book. It's my personal take. But it is what it is. That's what's going to drag this one down from a 10 out of 10 to an 8.5 out of 10. We're going to go ahead and give this one a 9 out of 10 for expanding the world, which is probably a category that I should have already been using and will definitely continue to use in other fantasy reviews. But in large series like this, there's a lot of heavy lifting that has to be done in the first book for setting up the world. And there's a lot of really interesting and clever ways in which authors expand on that base as the series continues. And I think that there's a lot of legitimate talent that goes into doing that well, that I'm going to start acknowledging a lot more as I continue to review longer series. So we're going to give Summer Night a 9 out of 10 for expanding the world, which is very closely related to the world building category, obviously, but we're going to call them separate categories. We're going to give this book, I'm going to say, let's call it a 9 out of 10 for characters. This is when Dresden really starts to feel like Dresden. There's a very powerful character moment for him right at the very end that I'm going to get to later. And Murphy really starts to be developed. Billy the werewolf. In addition to that, we get to see the Fae quite a bit more in this book. And their society as a character begins to develop in ways that I really appreciate. And so we're going to give this one a 9 out of 10 for character. So we're going to give Summer Night 8 out of 10 overall. I really like this book. It's an improvement over Grave Peril. It's definitely an improvement over Full Moon, and really a return to what we saw in Stormfront, but in a very different flavor, if that makes sense. It's much more epic fantasy and much less detective novel. So on to some highlights. I wanted to highlight for sure the ending to the story, where Dresden goes and plays D&D with Billy and the werewolves. Really was a powerful character moment to me, and him having that continues to be, later in the series, one of the things that really grounds him. It only comes up once or twice, but you know that it's there in the background, that he's going to these D&D nights, that's part of what's making him normal and sane, is having these friends to interact with and be there for him and support him. And I, for one, really appreciate not only that moment here in this book, but that moment going throughout the entire series and its ramifications. I also wanted to highlight the introduction of Ebenezer, one of my favorite characters in the series, but that scene in particular, definitely enjoyed him and the whole sequence with the White Council, some of my favorite parts of this book, and they don't have much to do in this book in itself, but the whole cast of characters that get introduced definitely stay important throughout the series and are some of my favorite things. Ebenezer and that entire cast of characters that are introduced in that sequence are definitely important for the story moving forward, and some of the big drivers of future, not the plots of future books, but the plot of the Dresden Files as a whole, and the war with the vampires, which is going to be one of the biggest things going on in Dresden Files from here on out, at least until book 11. Also, because it needs to be highlighted, for sure, during the final battle, when Dresden yells out, "I don't believe in fairies," and charges in to fight, is one of the funniest jokes in the entire series, in a lot of books. Just funny AF. 10 out of 10 stars for that line alone. Definitely appreciated it. So I will say that I didn't much care for Elaine in this book. This is our first proper introduction to the character, and I didn't really care for her. I understand that she's important to Dresden, and I appreciate her in the story. I just don't know that she's a character that I care for very much, but I definitely should mention that she's in the book, as well as Mab and Mauve and the Summer Lady and the Summer Mother. Also, definitely wanted to highlight the conversation that Dresden has with the Summer and Winter Mothers. I just realized that I accidentally called the Summer Queen the Summer Mother, but I meant the Summer Queen as a nebulous force of nature is introduced in this book. But then also the Summer and Winter Mothers, the scene where they talk to Dresden is one of my favorites so far in the series. It really does a lot to build the lore and to build the atmosphere for going into the final battle. So I really appreciated that. So I also definitely want to take a minute to talk about how, and I mentioned this on Twitter if you follow me over there, but yeah, I think that this marks a change in the direction that the Dresden Files is going from basically here on out. And that, as I talked about quite a bit at the beginning of the video, we're going to see much more epic fantasy. And it has a lot to do with Dresden's state of mind. In the first 3 books, I mean, Susan was there trying to boost him up, but I feel like the first 3 books, and this book as well, are just a steady descent for Dresden into loneliness and bitterness and frustration and anger. And it's that decision to go play D&D with Billy and the Werewolves that really starts to lift his spirits and give him a sort of grounding. And he carries that forward into the next arc of this series. And that's one of the major things that marks the change in tone, as well as the mysteries will continue to take more and more of they're less in the forefront from this point forward. There are more long-term mysteries, like who the traitor in the White Court is, which is a mystery introduced in this book that won't get answered for many, many books. And then there's other mysteries like what's going on with Susan, various things like that are going to continue to follow Dresden, multiple books, but individual mysteries, mysteries in individual books are going to take much more of a backseat to the plot of that book, if that makes any sense. So I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I really have been loving the Dresden Files, and I'm trying to make these reviews as quickly as I can so I can get back to reading them. That's the reason I took a break at book 11, was to give myself a pause to catch up in these reviews. If you don't mind, please consider liking this video and leaving a comment. It really helps this video reach more people. In addition, please consider subscribing to the channel. In addition, you can also follow me on Instagram and on Twitter, where I post my upcoming schedule and interact with other fantasy fans. In addition, I also have a Twitch where I play classic games every Tuesday and Thursday at 4:30 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time and every other Sunday at noon. I haven't been the best about that schedule recently. I've had a lot going on in my life, but I do try to play on there as regularly as possible, and I also hop on other days to just mess around for a little while. So if you find that interesting, you can find me over on Twitch at The Light My Man Cave. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see y'all later.